everyone. Welcome to AMASV Podcast Episode 11, titled Podcast Production. My name is Hanneti Karaja, and I am the Vice President of Virtual Programming at AMASV. Today I'm speaking with Nico Johnson of SunCast Media. Thank you for joining me, Nico.
Good to see you. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Nico has hosted his own podcast for 8 years and has since become an entrepreneur as well as a known subject matter expert in the solar industry. The twice weekly SunCast podcast has a global audience of thousands in over 100 countries with nearly 500,000 downloads. In this episode, I'll be asking Nico about best practices for podcast production, as well as growing your audience and finding your niche. So, Nico, tell me about turning your podcast into a business.
Sure. Is there a particular aspect of turning it into a business that calls you most, Hanneti?
I'd say what motivated you most to think I can actually do this and I can actually become an entrepreneur with my idea and my work with the podcast.
Yeah. Well, necessity is the mother of invention. I lost my job in 2015, 3 months after I started my podcast, and I'll never forget the sort of the telltale signs internally at the company where I kind of hated working there, to be honest. But they, the guy who ran the business came in the day that I launched the first episode as a side hustle, really, just sort of a side project to find more interesting information and education and create my own curriculum, as it were, for business development in Latin America within the solar industry. The president of the company came in and he says, "Hey, how often are you going to do this?" And I said, "Oh, every week." He looked at me and says, "Good luck." Um, and I could read behind that, how you can do that and have a job, because there's a lot of work involved in podcasting. And it's true. Podcast is a medium, just like writing blogs or doing videos or any other sort of digital creative outlet. And from a marketing perspective, it's a very useful medium because it engenders a sense of closeness and rapport, and rather quickly, much more so than interviewing someone in order to write a blog for them, or doing a video where people are kind of a little unsure about whether or not they look great, or whether or not they, are we going to edit this out? And so my podcast gave me an opportunity to have those conversations, and we weren't video first to begin with folks that I really admired. But when I started thinking about a podcast in 2013, like most entrepreneurs, overthinking it, and entrepreneurs never getting to it, I reached out to a guy named John Lee Dumas that a lot of podcasters know, and over the years became friends with him. But he said, "No, Nico, you got to niche down." And it occurred to me one day on a call with an analyst in the solar industry that I had more knowledge than most people about the solar industry, because analysts were calling, asking me questions about where the market was going. And that was the moment that I said, okay, I think I should start a podcast about the solar industry. There were very few, if any, that were weekly. I don't think there were any real weekly solar podcasts. But my wife, valedictorian of her high school and college class, business student, said, okay, if you're going to do this, you need a coach. And if you're going to get a coach, you need a business plan. And so I produced both a coach and a business plan. $5,000 later, I had a podcast plan. And that was 2015. I produced 8 episodes before I hit the wall of like what's known as pod fade. Like, am I really doing this right? Should I keep going? And Eddie, I'm sure you've experienced that in just the 11 episodes that you've done. And I paused for a moment. I'd also, as I mentioned, lost my job. I didn't see that as an opportunity to double down on the podcast. I saw that as a clear warning sign that I should figure out how to make more, cover my assets, as it were, for my family. And I got on, I got invited about 8 months later to be a guest on Podcast Junkies with a good buddy in the industry now, Harry, who runs Podcast Junkies. And he kicked me squarely in the tush and said, "You got to get back on the horse. You've got a great niche. You've got great experience. There's no reason why you're not podcasting except you don't believe in yourself, or you don't believe this will make money. Which is it?" And I said, "Well, maybe it's that I don't believe it's going to make money." And I said, "You're right. I'm going to double down." I did 3 interviews and published them. And one of the largest publicly traded companies in the industry called and said, "Hey, this is really interesting, and you're focused on our niche of a niche, which is solar in Latin America. And we'd love to know how we could partner with you because we've got a great story about our customers down there." And I called up John Dumas and I said, nah, 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 nah. I'm not too niche down, because he said, when I said I'm doing a podcast on the solar industry in Latin America, that, Nico, when I say niche down, I mean an inch wide and a mile deep, not a millimeter wide. And I saw that as an opportunity because I'd been working in sales and marketing my entire career, and I really did understand that there's something to building an audience that is monetizable. And a lot of podcasters get it wrong. They think that I need as big an audience as possible in order to make money. And that's because they live in the world of CPM, where they might make $20 for every 1,000 earballs that land on their show, which is abysmal and makes me want to puke. And I would never, ever be able to consider myself a full-time podcaster if that's the world I lived in. Thankfully, it's not. In 2019, after fast forward 3 years, after pretty successful run, both consulting and having sponsors on the show, sponsors who were paying what I know my then like 400 downloads per episode audience was worth. And I can get into details if you want. I had someone come up to me at a trade show and they said, "Nico, you know what's funny about you is that you think that this SunCast thing is a side hustle and that all these consulting gigs are your main hustle. But the rest of us, we see you as SunCast and SunCast is you. And like these other things that you consult with are like a distraction and a weird sort of attachment to your brand. Why are you not just full-time on SunCast?" And I went home with both this sort of lightning bolt moment and conviction that I didn't need consulting anymore. And from that moment on, I doubled down on my commitment to making this work. And Eddie, to sort of wrap that into something that is sort of tangible for the rest of your audience, I want to read something that was recently shared with me. And if I had read it or had it read to myself back when I was going through these machinations, as an entrepreneur, generally, it would have been meaningful. So this is a quote that probably some of your audience has heard. I'm just going to read it verbatim because I like it. I'll read the whole thing. But William Hutchison Murray from the Scottish Himalayan expedition said, "Until one is committed, there's hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, and material assistance which no man could have dreamed would have come his way." He goes on to say, "I've learned a deep respect for one of Goethe's couplets, which may or may not have been said by Goethe. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it."
No, I really like your journey towards becoming the subject matter expert that you are today. And what was that moment like for you when someone told you, you realize this isn't just a side hustle, you realize this is bigger than you perceive it to be?
Yeah, in a word, catalytic, because it created for me that moment where I said, okay, if I never commit to this as the thing and believe that I'm capable of doing it, I paid a coach to help me. I'm friends with John Lee Dumas, for God's sake. Like, why do I continue to doubt myself and my capacity for earning money at this? Yeah, that moment was catalytic. I wish I remembered who said that in my life, but there are these angels that move through our world that just push us in ever the slightest direction. It's like the difference of that 1 degree off from New York to LA that lands you in Seattle. Who knows where I'd be if not for that conversation.
Describe some ways becoming an entrepreneur has changed your life.
I probably have always been destined to be an entrepreneur, and I didn't believe that early on. I was squarely in the category of wantrepreneur, which are those folks that desire so desperately to live a different life than the one they have right now, and they watch every Gary Vee video and dream of the day they can kick a job to the curb. And I knew that entrepreneurship, while a difficult path, which it is, represented freedom in my life. And the thing that I value most is that I have the thing that most people will never earn or find or gift themselves, and that is time. I have time freedom to spend it or invest it or waste it as I see fit. When I left Miami after losing my last real W-2 job and moved up to Durham, North Carolina, my wife said, I don't care where you spend your time for making money, as long as it doesn't interfere with your time for making family. And if there's one way that entrepreneurship has changed my life, it is that it has given me time with my children. And I travel probably as much or more than I ever did, but when I'm with them, I'm with them. And it hasn't always been that way. I've been doing this for 8 years now, and I had a entrepreneurial run for 3 or 4 years before I went into the corporate world. It's not my first time starting a business. But it taught me that you got to move forward in the absence of certainty and information, or you'll never move forward. There's no perfect time. There's no perfect template. Oh my God. If there's one thing we do so well as marketers is fool the others around us into believing that there's a template that'll solve your problems. There's a template that'll make somebody else money. That's what templates do. Templates help others attract you to their product or service. So stop chasing templates. Nobody can build the business that you're meant to build. Nobody could have instructed me on what SunCast Media would become. Few that work for me can even believe what I wanted to become, and that it's possible. And I can guarantee you, in the South Florida Podcasters Association, where I first cut my teeth with, notables like J.B. Glossinger, like the morning coach, and Jared Easley, the founder of Podcast Movement, Donald Kelly, the sales evangelist, part of the HubSpot network. Like I've been surrounded by podcasters my entire podcast sort of life since 2013, 14, 15, when I launched mine. None of whom, when I speak with them, can believe the relative amount of money I make per download, because I don't look at downloads, right? So if you change the metric that you're measured by, it matters as an entrepreneur. And only as an entrepreneur can you change the metric you're measured by. You can't, as an employee, tell your employer, nope, I actually want to be measured by something else. Thank you very much. So my productivity, my value is measured by my impact and output in the world, not by the number of listeners that show up. Anecdotally, sat down with our platinum sponsor for our podcast, which is a 6-figure check they cut every year. And I said, he's become a friend because they've done it for 2 years now and probably will do year 3. I said, why do you keep spending the gobsmack amount of money that you spend on my piddly podcast, right? And I'm joking because I don't really think it's piddly, but just being self-effacing. And he says, well, I'll give you 2 examples. I walk into Senator Feinstein's office in California, and one of her staffers says, oh, your company, I've heard of you on the podcast. And there's only one podcast that we sponsor that they would have heard of us on. So right there justifies the 6-figure check. And as if that weren't enough, I go to a trade show, and one of our biggest customers comes up and says, oh, I really like this new thing that I heard in the ad on the podcast, and love to talk about it. That's a $10 million check. I'm like, that's a fraction of what that $10 million in revenue represents for us. So having the capacity to learn how to build a product that reaches a specific audience and how to monetize it is exactly how entrepreneurship has changed my life.
I think it's a really pivotal moment when you have to ask someone the question, why do you believe in me? Because what you're doing is so significant, but like just the hustle of the day to day, it likely more so feels like you're just trying to make it still, you
Yeah,
know? You
every
resonate
day.
with that?
I don't believe I've made it because I put my bar way higher than my peers, uh, than being as good as my peers. I mean, right? Like I never feel like I've made it. I feel like if you feel like you've made it, then almost, and maybe this is part of being Gen X, but like if you feel like you've made it, you weren't trying hard enough. You didn't set good enough goals. Uh, and just a slight correction from the intro, which I'm really proud of, like 500,000 downloads, but we're almost at 1,000,000 downloads now after 8 years, almost at 700 episodes. And, and I still get people come up to me and say things like, "You're famous," within our very small circle, like a big fish in small pond, perhaps. And that doesn't really resonate for me. Like, I don't want to be famous. I didn't start this to be famous or recognized. But what resonates is when someone calls me Stephanie Johnson. I talked to her last week, and she said, because of SunCast, I nailed my job interview and got this executive director role. And they looked at me like I had horns when in the interview I said I have zero experience in the industry because I had such conviction and substantive answers for their questions that they couldn't believe I'd never spent any time in the industry. And the answer to their question, how'd you get up to speed so fast, was SunCast. That matters. That I'm famous is irrelevant. That our work helps other people become relevant. Now, that is something that I can't buy. That's something that our sponsors can't gift me, right? That comes from dedication to the craft, consistency in the work, killing the things that don't work and focusing on the things that do. Asking the hard question, does this matter to you or anyone else that would pay money for it? It's one of the things that most entrepreneurs hide from.
For sure. And as a subject matter expert, would
Mm.
you say that you have to continue to educate yourself on new
Mm.
developments in the industry? Or how do you kind of maintain, the curriculum that goes into, being this advisor to people in the industry?
I don't know that my answer is going to be particularly helpful because I want answers that are, so I can give you very specific answers, but I feel like answers in podcasts should be relatable. And unless you um, start a podcast, are a great networker, and are willing to read 3 hours a day, my advice is not going to resonate for you. But if you're in that Venn diagram of willing to do whatever it takes to reach the people that you need to reach, then this advice is for you. I feed my mind constantly. I consume content. I'm an infinite learner, as Reid Hoffman would say, through podcast, websites, Reddit. Uh, from the moment I wake up at 6 a.m. till the moment I go to bed around midnight, I'm, some level of deleting notifications, reading articles from Business Insider or New York Times or Canary Media or Latitude or Heat Map News. And they're both industry specific as well as outside of the industry, because you have to be able to do the one thing that has been the most valuable in my career. James Altucher calls it idea sex, the ability to take something that's working somewhere else and apply it to where you are working, but have enough knowledge about where you are working to know how that thing would apply. That's the magic sauce. And so what did I get out of 700 episodes on SunCast? Pattern matching. I can tell you more about industry leaders and the products they're working on than just about any other rock you could turn over in the solar industry, right? And as a result, now after 8 years of that and 18 years in the industry, people call me and say, "Can you MC our event, or can you help us work out this problem, or who do you know that can do that?" Which is my favorite question, because I probably know 3 people that can help you with that problem. So being helpful is and being of service to others, and leveraging that network is the most important aspect of building the network at all. I was just talking with one of my mastermind members this morning, how, I've got someone in my network, a very well-known podcaster that I know his real name, and he texts me back, and I've never in the 8 years that I've known him made a single ask of his time, of his knowledge. He could answer all my problems and questions. But I know there's a moment where I'm going to fly into the town he lives in. We're going to crack open a bottle of tequila and we're going to have a long conversation. And he'll answer any question I have. Right? Valuing and understanding the timing of that is a critical contributor to being successful, in my opinion. And I've been able to navigate that. As a podcaster, we get access to people that others don't. We are able to ask them lots of information on and off camera. I've got hundreds of mentors now and actually friends. Like I've got friends that I had as guests who are luminaries in the industry. I could name drop ad nauseum and it wouldn't serve anyone except to say, like, the way that you enter into these relationships as a servant, a giver versus a taker, matters.
Why do you think that people want to be on your podcast? Speaking of connections.
Okay, so there's why I think they want to be on the podcast versus why they think they want to be on the podcast. People think I have a bigger show than I have, so they think my audience is bigger than it really is, and I don't dissuade them at all or prove them wrong. And then the ones who don't care how big the audience is come on my show for the real reason, which is I have honed the process of interviewing more than any of my peers. There is nobody in my field that does what I do the way I do it. Nobody. I say that because that's what I've been told. And my business partner reinforces and edifies that in me so that I can believe it. But people want to come on the show because I give them a chance to be introspective. I ask them questions nobody else is going to ask them. I invite a sense of rapport and vulnerability. I get stories out of them that their own employees say they've never heard before. And it's damn near one of the best recruitment tools you'll have.
Got it, for sure. So let's talk about the podcast landscape. Why do you think that podcasts are successful? And let me just pull some experience from your own podcast as well in this answer.
Yeah. Why are podcasts successful? I wish I had the ability to answer this at scale, where it would be relevant for everyone. So maybe this is tracks and maybe it doesn't. But I said earlier, and I think that this is probably the core of it, podcasts that are successful are defined in different ways. If your goal is 1 million downloads an episode, I have no advice for you. I have no clue how to do that. I really don't. I stand in awe of Lex Friedman and Andrew Huberman and anybody else who just comes out of what seemingly nothing. They're interesting. They're highly educated. But I mean, Lex Friedman is kind of boring to listen to. Like, he's not a particularly good interviewer. He's cracked the code socially to get into some of the biggest names. But it's precisely his dryness that attracts most people. His clinical nature, right? Andrew Huberman is definitely one of the smartest neuroscientists I've heard on record, on a who's able to like actually teach what he knows. If you are able to visualize the audience you serve, answer the questions that are rattling around inside their head out loud, or bring experts into their world that they wouldn't have had a chance to talk to or listen to, and let them feel like they understand that person better, or help them feel like now not only are they smarter, they understand that person better, but that person's a real normal person that puts their pants on one leg at a time. What? They're not like a demigod? Okay. Life's not so hard. Great. I can do this. Right. Tim Denning said in a recent LinkedIn article, actually a Medium article, something that really stands out to me. He said, you will succeed on LinkedIn. I think this is true for podcasts too, to the extent that you realize your job is not to impress your audience, but to help them see their own intelligence. right? They are smart too, and they want to feel smart. And if you make them feel dumb by being super smart, then maybe they admire that, but that's not very relatable. So I see podcasts succeeding right now because they're relatable, because they're funny, humor works. If you just incidentally, if you aren't listening to Pete Holmes, We Made It Weird, I just discovered it. Holy crap, it's the best podcast. Oh my God, Pete is the best. If I could ever, I want to interview Pete Holmes. If you're listening to this, Pete, thank you for tuning into this conversation. But Pete, myself, the people I admire, they're willing to be real. They're willing to be honest and vulnerable. Brene Brown talks about this all the time. So the podcasts that I see succeeding, they do that really well, that vulnerability. But they also do the three things I mentioned earlier. They're dedicated to the craft. I've invested, probably to an exaggerated extent, thousands of dollars in high quality audio gear, because the number one reason that people leave a podcast is because the audio sucks. Number one, high quality editing, because even though I can invest in a $400 microphone, an $800 interface, a nice fancy stand, a nice camera, I can't make it sound good. I pay an editor who went to the best school in Australia, and he is a world-class editor. And so my quality from day one has been as good as it is today in terms of like the ability to get the maximum out of the signal. Okay, and that signal matters because it's going into an intimate organ, our ears. Consistency is the key. Cliff Ravenscraft, the one of my sort of podcast mentors and friends and coaches, he taught me early on that you got to show up every week. There's no excuses. Dave Jackson, same thing. Two podcast coaches that are luminaries, right? They said, show up every week. You can't, and don't miss. Your listeners will start to expect you on Thursdays. In part, I publish on Thursday because that's when Cliff published his episodes, right? I publish on Tuesdays because that's when the record industry publishes new albums, if you didn't know that. So Tuesdays and Thursdays are the best days people are most engaged. So if you understand that craft, really be dedicated to the craft, be consistent, and then kill your darlings, which is a writing term, but not every idea is going to work. Not every episode that you think is going to hit is going to hit. You got to wake up and do it again anyway. So when you go pro, and there's a book called Turning Pro, I could just go on and on about the people who have influenced me. But when you turn pro, you realize that this is not a hobby. And if you can make money on podcasting as a hobby, God bless you. You have really tapped into a vein of an audience that is unique, and there's something about you that's charismatic and funny and entertaining. Because at the end of the day, podcast has to be entertaining. It competes with every other form of entertainment and distraction. And so you got to kill all the ideas that don't work and only focus on the ones that do. And you got to focus on expanding your audience while not alienating them. So I could go deep into how that has evolved for me over the last 8 years, but it would take way longer than the time that your podcast sort of parameters are, Hannity.
Thank you. Very good answer. And, based off of that question, I wanted to ask, do you recommend that any business or organization start a podcast, and how that would significantly increase their brand awareness?
Without question. Going back to what I said earlier, podcast is just one more marketing channel. It happens to be a very vulnerable and intimate marketing channel, and it's abused. And we're seeing the rise and fall, where basically if you're famous, you can have a podcast. It doesn't have to be good. You don't have to give a shit about a good microphone or anything like that. And they think that it's going to just sort of track alongside their IG or their movie, whatever, right? And so every famous person starts a podcast. Very few succeed. Pete Holmes, one of the great ones that is succeeding, because it gets hard. However, and if you're in the solar industry, you'll recognize. So there are a few that work really well. The Decarb Race by some friends of mine down in Texas. It's run by the CEO of the company. Lincoln interviews prospective clients. and um, and he gives perspective on a very niche part of a market. Um, Gil Jenkins and his friends run Climate Positive by Hannon Armstrong. It's a branded podcast that Hannon puts on, and it is fantastic. Did an interview with one of my sort of industry luminary mentors, Dan Sugar, that I wish I had done. It's like, and this is a branded podcast. They're not talking about Hannon Armstrong. They're talking about where the industry is going. And at the same time, they're demonstrating the level of intellect inside the company. They're demonstrating where the industry is going and why a company like Hannon Armstrong is trustworthy and believable and has merit to be considered. Another friend, the folks at Clean Capital, John and their team, like John started a podcast years ago called Experts Only. And it, like the cover art looks like the double black diamond for skiing, right? Experts Only. And the not even secret about why he started that is because he wanted to use it as a calling card, a door opener to prospective customers. So should a brand start a podcast? Absolutely yes, but you got to be dedicated to it and you got to make it not about you. And if you can do those two things, then it doesn't matter if you've got 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 listeners. It matters if you can repurpose that content. And that's the magic of why this is an absolutely wonderful medium, is because it's not just for, Gary Vee says, take that one piece of content and turn it into 63, and far too few people do that.
Yeah. It would be having like an inside perspective if a company had their own podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you want that, if that's worthwhile, some companies, I don't care about the inside perspective that they bring, because their own inside perspective is they can't present it without selling their services. Like they can't do it. It's there's so many podcasts out there where it's an insider's view, and really it's just pardon the term, but like it's a circle jerk of like, let's show everybody how smart we are and why they should be in the room with us. And I just don't think that serves the audience.
What do you think that the top genres of podcasts are going to be in 2024, or what they were in 2023, just based off of, your podcast listening,
Oh
or,
yeah.
just your
I'm
perspective?
in a niche of a niche, so I don't know what the genres are, but the things that are timeless are comedy and murder mysteries, right? So science fiction, true crime. Those are perennially the top segments. So how can you weave that into whatever niche you're working in, right? Start trying to compete in comedy is extremely difficult. And then I believe sort of some of the folks I'm watching, that variety shows are going to make a comeback if they aren't already back. John Ushai started his own YouTube channel after working at YouTube. He said, the question is, what is your variety show? And that tells me that he sees that happening in YouTube. So maybe that's your answer. I like watching Creator Science with Jay Klaus. If you're thinking about being a creator, you should definitely tune in and subscribe to Jay. Hat tip to Jay Klaus, doing an unbelievable job of really providing insight on what it's like to create a product that creates value that other people will give a crap about. And once you do that, you can build an audience around it and monetize it. But until you do that, nobody cares.
Mm-hmm. What are your top tips for marketing yourself and your podcast?
Be tips for marketing yourself and your podcast. Find a niche. Be ever present in that niche. Be consistent with your content. Be unafraid to tell people that you're doing a thing and that they should pay attention. I could give specifics on different platforms. We spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. Carousels are underutilized now because they were overutilized when they first came out. So that's working. Video, a lot of people, ourselves included, started posting like, oh, micro content clips of my interview with such and such. Who cares? We get less traction and views when we share really insightful snippets from name brand guests than when I turn the camera on and say, I did an interview with this guy, and you aren't gonna believe it. Blew my mind. I learned this, and this. You should check it out. I'll link it in the comments. Right, like run and gun. That feeling that it's not overproduced is more attractive to the audience in 2024 than it ever has been.
I agree with that. I feel like I've been less attracted to short form content lately than I have been long form content. For example, if I see like a short clip of a podcast, I just want to look for the rest. I'm like,
Yeah.
where's the entire podcast?
So how do we do
I'm
that, right? How
interested.
do we feed that curiosity faster? How do we actually make it such that you can get to the rest? That technology doesn't really exist the way we need it to.
Yeah. Tell me about establishing your brand for the
Hmm.
podcast.
Hannity, I'm glad you asked that question. I don't get, after 8 years in, a lot of time to think about sort of the origin story of the brand, but I'm a acolyte of Tim Ferriss, and when he was coming up with the book cover for 4 Hour Workweek, he made up like 3 different book jackets and took them into the airport and tested them out to see which one people would pick up. And he sent an email around to all his friends, right? So I hired a professional logo designer, and I did a bunch of, God, I wish we had something like Midjourney back then, but I did a bunch of designs myself on, sort of in paint that are mock-ups and concepts. And in parallel, and so there's like graphic elements. And in parallel, I started coming up with ideas for names. Like I was unoriginal in the sense that my friend Adam James was supposed to be my podcast co-host, and he was doing the Latin America Solar Report, LATAM Solar Report for Green Tech Media at the time. And I was like, okay, cool. Imitation is the highest form of flattery. I'm going to name my podcast LATAM Solar Podcast, or the LATAM Solar Report. And they didn't have a trademark on it, so it didn't matter. I just adopted it. That was literally what we called the first episode, and that was the only time we called it that, because I had recorded the first episode before I actually came out with like the final name and logo before I launched the episodes. The first sort of series of 3 or 4 that I had. But I'm in the solar industry, and I was going to be focused on the solar industry. And let's see, I've been holding this up, so I'm going to take a drink while you take a look. And if you look at the cover art,
Oh wow. That's so
of
cool.
that, right? Always on brand. The circle is just a normal. It's like a sun circle, and then concentric circles, and those represent like ripples in a pond, but also sound waves. And I don't think I have the original, like my favorite graphic, because it's currently in a cease and desist from SunCast Corporation, which I didn't know existed. Really important to know going in.
Mhm.
But it has all lowercase, the word SunCast, the specific, like we came up with our own font, and it has 3 sound bars on the outside, right? And of course, this injection molded plastic company that's been around since 1991 wants to come after me because they're going to be in the solar space, but they're not really in the solar space, and they weren't then. And I've been the only one in, doing media in the solar industry under the name SunCast since 2015. And I looked at the different names that we thought about, talked about, and came up with a list of probably 15 or 20. I've got a folder with a document where I just sort of wrote down, dumped my brain of all the possible ideas of the name. And I sent that list to like 5 people, and they were like, this is too long of a list. Like, don't you have 3 or 4 that stand out? And I shortened it to 3 or 4, and I sent that to like maybe 50 people. And they voted on them. And the top 3, I just sort of sat with it and talked to my wife, and I was like, this one, SunCast, seems like it's the most timeless and durable, and also points to the fact that I'm in the solar industry and I'm doing a podcast, SunCast. It seemed obvious at that point, but it wasn't obvious all along. And then SunCast Media, I had an LLC, Sparrow Ventures. I didn't have SunCast Media as a brand, but when I got the cease and desist from SunCast Corporation, I did take that logo off and of the website, at least disintermediate a little bit, or disambiguate a little bit the brand confusion they said was supposedly happening in the market. And I added the word media, and I came up with another logo, which I don't love, to be honest. A buddy of mine came up with that in Mexico, right?
Mhm.
For a trade show we were going to, and a client sent me that, which is pretty freaking cool. Um, and it just stuck, and I hate change, so I never changed it. And then people start to associate you with it. And then I realized I've had these sort of crisis moments where I don't know if I want to lean in harder on like building the Nico Johnson personal brand as like subject matter expert and industry thought leader and, MC and luminary, and like building a media company versus SunCast Media, which does is the agency of record for creating compelling stories and content that moves the clean energy transition forward. But where like anybody could participate in that, and doesn't have to be like magnanimous and charismatic and Nico. Um, so as a founder and entrepreneur, I go back and forth in this swing of like I have an ego like everyone else, and I love the fact that when I walk the show floor, people recognize me, and it helps make the job easier. But I would love to have SunCast Media to really stand on its own and not need like the Nico factor of my ability to walk in a room and introduce 30 people to each other. But the fact that I've built a brand where when I walk in a room, someone says, "Do you know Nico?" And they may say no, but when they say from, he's SunCast Media, they go, "Oh, you're Nico," right? That's cool. That for me is like, all right, we're starting to turn the corner now from kind of growing up as an entrepreneur, starting to turn the corner from like now this brand can be, can stand on its own 2 feet. I've like helped it through the toddler phase. And that for me is the hardest part of establishing a brand, is getting it to the place where it can stand alone from the creator of it, right? And be recognizable in and of itself.
Wow. Were you also surprised when someone recognized the name of your company versus they didn't know who you were as a person?
Yeah, that's really that was like, wait a minute. I mean, let's be honest. Anybody would tell you that's like a hit to your ego at that point. You're like, wait, and then somebody on the other shoulder goes, "This is what you
Yeah.
wanted," right? Yep.
I feel like I'd be that kind of person to be like, yeah, I did this thing and it's actually being recognized. That's cool. I mean, also sometimes you can't tell who a person is if you just like see them in person versus like the
Yeah.
last time you've seen them in like
Mhm.
content or, other medium formats.
Yeah. I had
So
long hair at one point. Um, yeah. So a lot of people still think of me as long hair, Nico, because the whole pandemic when I was very, very visible because we needed to be. I had long hair, and so that's fun. They'll come up and be like, "Hey, you cut your hair." I'm like, "Yeah, 2 years ago."
so you have become like more recognizable as a person since then, you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of folks, we're all kind of stuck in who we were in the pandemic somehow. People were like, "Hey, you still living in Mexico?" Not since 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, so it's more like, the solid connections that you make, they're more so familiar with you, but a lot of other people are more so familiar with your brand. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some ways you've invested in your podcast and how has it contributed to your overall business?
Hmm. I'll tell you, there are simple ways which we talked about that I think are table stakes. Um, and any podcaster that takes it seriously eventually has to invest in like the basics to get a good feed and clarity and crispness. The 2 ways that I've invested in my show that have made a material impact in my business are leaning into live events and leaning into video. So at the beginning of last year, 2023, I decided we're going video first. And by February, doggone it, we have to publish an episode that is video on YouTube, and then you can publish the audio. Um, and we did that. And then it took us probably 8 months to get that to be a consistent practice where we knew we could deliver on it. And then it took us from probably September of 23 to now, February, Q1 of 2024, to get to the place where we can not only deliver on the video first, but micro content that is meaningful, not just like AI generated, and gives an insight of what the macro video would look like. And I'll come back to that in a second and why that matters. Because it was very intentional. I had a business idea in mind. But in 2018, I was walking the trade show for our industry that's the biggest. At the time, it was like 20,000 attendees. This past year, it was 40,000 attendees. It's called RE Plus, Renewable Energy Plus. And I remember calling my team in the cab on the way back to the airport, and I said, next year, 2019, we will be the podcasters at the show. Like, we're going to have a booth in the middle of the show. And it'd never been done before at our show. I didn't know if it had ever been done before at any show, but I had to imagine that it had. Like, NAM, there's like a bunch of music, and media, New Media Expo. Like, of course, there are podcast booths there, but not in like real infrastructure industry trade shows, And in 2019 in Salt Lake, Salt Palace, we had a podcast booth, a podcast studio. And since 2019, not only have we helped generate more than $500,000 in revenue for that trade show, and we get a portion of that revenue, but we have firmly, established ourselves as a recognizable brand that produces high quality in-person and virtual content. And the skill to do that took years to hone, but it paid off in dividends in spades during the pandemic, because we pivoted to doing virtual events. And I tried everything. I spent $25,000 on a license to Verbella during the pandemic so I could do a virtual VR studio trade show, SunCast Puerto Rico. And we ended up making money on it. Like, I won't tell you the numbers, but we did pretty well during the pandemic, doing a 3D virtual reality world where we set up a exhibit hall. Like, I invested in that. That was a big expense that came off of my balance sheet. And 2 months later, Joe Biden got elected. And the week after he was elected, Jigger Shaw called me on my phone and said, want you to do a thing. It's the pandemic. We can't do the inaugural ball. We want to do like a virtual inaugural ball for the clean energy sector in honor of Joe Biden being elected as president.
Oh, that's a crazy accomplishment. Wow.
Well, I said, no way, I'm not doing that. And he called me back again, and I said, Jigger, I'm not doing it. And then he called me back a third time, and I said, okay, what I hear you saying is, what's the price that will convince you to do it? So here's my price. And we produced a virtual event for the clean energy sector that was the inaugural Joe Biden, Biden-Harris inaugural ball for the clean energy sector. We had 3,500 attendees. It was mad. It was madness. And we pulled it off in the middle of the pandemic. I literally laid in the floor I'm standing on right now and cried my eyes out after it was over, because it was just like this wash of relief, but realization. Like, I just created 4 hours of television. And so that belief that it created in me cemented the desire and the realization that I can do anything we put our minds to. I can create anything I want to create. So coming back around when we went video first, the reason it matters is that we were able to go from video first to consistently producing video alongside our podcast to consistently producing micro content that tells a story, is that now more than a third of our revenue for 2024 comes from a product we created, producing evergreen story-based content for industry participants, where we take their content and turn it into micro content. And that any podcaster can do if you learn how to do all this stuff, right? But they can't do it with my credibility and 20 years in the industry and the network and black book that I've built thanks to 700 episodes of my podcast, right? So full circle, I've spent the last 8 years building the credibility and trust in the industry, that when I come to someone and say, I see you creating this content and you're not really doing anything with it afterwards, let me help you create it in a way that gives you not just top of funnel awareness, but like middle of funnel conversion and middle of funnel sort of question answering and bottom of funnel conversions. Like, how do you take this content and use it in your sales and marketing process rather than just in your top of funnel awareness, which is where most people think podcasts sits, and it's where most people think maybe webinars sit. We're flipping the script on that because we've learned how to hold space, capture a story, turn it into micro content, and repurpose it to an audience. And when you can do that, you don't need an audience of 1 million. You need an audience of 1.
When you reflect back to your accomplishments, do you think about the person that you were when you first started the podcast and your business, and like what he would have wanted for you?
Yeah. When my wife said, okay, this is, if you're going to do this, let's do it in a way that gives us back to the thing we talked about earlier, time freedom. What does that look like? What if like right now you're making a couple $100,000 a year? What if you could build a company that allowed you to work 3 days a week and make $200,000? And you don't aspire to make $1 million, like you're fine with that 200,000 and 3 days of time exchange for it instead of 5 or 6 or traveling all over the world. What if we could accomplish that? What would that do for our family life? You would have an entire day that you could focus on your own mental health and well-being and whatever the heck you want to go do. You could have a whole day that you could spend with me as your wife, and we could just hang out, maybe while the kids are in school. And we could still have a 2-day weekend that's like completely full, and we're not trying to catch up on the weekend with family and with things because we missed you during the week. What if you could do that? And that thought experiment fundamentally changed what I'm building and why I'm building it. And it's still something I'm chasing because I do work. I have high ambitions, and I work to fill the void, you know? We have software that saves us time. What do we do with that time? We fill it with other things. So there's this continual chasing the dream that entrepreneurs do get wrapped up in. And I think that your point is well taken. It's important to reflect back on what was the original intent. And would that version of Nico be proud of this version? And the answer is like, hell yes, he would. This version of Nico has coaching clients that have sold their businesses, has a mastermind, has business partners, has done over $1 million in revenue, has built an incorruptible network, has built tremendous value in the marketplace. The value of what I am experiencing today to that Nico is ineffable, right? It was aspirational at best. And yet I sit here today in 2024, most days not satisfied, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Not satisfied. Because I want to see that now that my impact is greater than just on my family. You know, I've got folks on my team that are tremendous individuals. I want to see them financially and professionally fulfilled. And I've got partners that are building really, really world-changing products, and I want to see those products in the right hands. And I see bad actors in the industry that I want to snuff out, and I see good actors in the industry that I want to elevate. And so our work's not done. Maybe it never will be.
Well, I thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Your entrepreneurial story is very inspiring and just shows, my audience what they can achieve if they just put their mind to it and they put in the hard work for it. And, with 8 years of having done the podcast, it just shows like the fruits of your labor.
Yeah.
So, I really appreciate it.
Hannity, I appreciate you. Thank you. It's not easy to press record. It's not easy to decide that you're going to do this in exchange for something else you can spend your time on. So to anyone, I see you, Mom, that's spending time pressing play on this content. Thank you. The only thing that you can't get back is the non-renewable resource of time. And you've invested it here. I hope that it has been valuable for you all as it has been for Hannity and I. I'm glad that we've gotten a chance to meet. Thank you, Mark Narius, for introducing us. And thank you all for tuning in as well.
Yes, speaking of mentors and great connections, Mark has been a great mentor for me, and he knows great people in the industry and overall in marketing in the content space. So I'm very glad we've had this interaction as well. I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
So if you'd like to visit Nico's business, SunCast Media, I will link the website below this video, as well as where you can listen to his podcast episodes, the SunCast podcast, as well as Nico's social channels and more information about his company as well.
Yeah, thank you, Hannity.
Yeah.
Super easy. Suncast.media. That's the new way to do URLs.
Very straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.